The European Union is likely going to begin its final collapse tomorrow. It may not happen. I'm not guaranteeing anything. But we are seeing something that it came about in a place I didn't predict necessarily would be the location, the epicenter of this earthquake. An earthquake that maybe isn't as surprising as Brexit, given recent events, but is probably along the same pattern. Brexit happened first, so this may have dampened the shock. But Holland is going to have an election tomorrow. I actually worked with a few Dutch people. They're actually not very political. They don't express their views. I mean, I have mixed views on the Dutch people. I think that they're a fine country, but they're kind of like not. They don't seem like the most serious people, business like. I did have one supervisor, by the way, who was Dutch. Pretty good guy. I'm not going to say it was great because I didn't really know him that well. But they're good people to work with. They're not. I mean, they're. I'm not making any blanket statements, but I worked with a lot of them. I'd say, probably over a dozen, because we had a lot of Dutch people in my company. Let me put it that way. The company that I worked for up until last month, and for this to happen, the election tomorrow, and a party that's demonstrably anti-European Union. I think it's called the VVP, the Freedom Party or something, or the People's Freedom Party. I don't remember what it's called. It's fronted by a man named Geert Wilders. I think I'm pronouncing it right. I'm not. I did try learning. I like to try to pick up languages, see if I have like a affinity for them. Doesn't always work. So I remember learning Dutch pronunciation, and the G in Dutch is the G sound that's so prominent in Arabic and Hebrew and even German, in fact. And Geert Wilders is very likely to have a major share of the vote tomorrow. And it's not guaranteed he's going to win control of the government because it's a multi-party system. But it's certainly going to shake up the balance of power in the Dutch parliament, because until now there's been a steady coalition of centrist groups that they don't want to really do any drastic change. They don't want to anger the EU, by the way. The national governments within the EU have traditionally, since the beginning of the EU, deferred a lot of their policy to Brussels, the capital of the European Union. And it's been a disastrous issue because those people are not accountable. A lot of the EU policy is made by bureaucrats. And we in the United States, maybe you don't give a fuck. Just like that video about Australia that I made, I actually got a few responses. I'm surprised I got so many responses because, nobody really gives a fuck about my channel, and I'm not even pretending otherwise. But I got a lot of responses from Australians because the Jackie Lambie video struck a chord. It's a very tight issue over there, and Americans need to start looking at the world not as a global community, but as we have common problems, and we have to sometimes reach across the ocean and talk about common solutions, not talk about owning everything together and sharing everything necessarily, but good neighbors have good fences. That's the attitude I think was traditional among a lot of leaders. I don't know who said that. I think it was FDR said good neighbors have good fences, but I could be wrong. But look, I predicted in, I believe, July on one of my page publications that the next domino to fall would be Italy. And in December, Italy vetoed in a referendum. They turned it down, is more proper to say. They voted down a constitutional amendment that would have elevated the powers of their federal government even higher. It would have possibly made the EU harder to exit from for the Italians, and they voted it down. And it was a major turning point, inflection point for the leading party. That I think is still called the Democratic Party of Italy. They go through names over there like hookers go through fishnets. But they did lose that referendum, and the prime minister had to resign. That's what happens in a lot of these cases. The same thing that happened after Brexit. Daniel Cameron resigned. The same thing is happening in France. The current president of France, they're not term limited, the current president of France, Francois Hollande, is not going to be the next president. He's refused to run again. Okay, in Germany, Angela Merkel is still trying to hang on to power. She's running for re-election. I think their election is in May. That's when I believe the election is. But Italy, I really thought would fall first. The referendum technically counts as a setback for the EU, but I believe that there would be elections much faster, and that this five-star movement that's anti-European Union would sweep into power, and the EU would instantly fall apart. And let me make this point. I could have made another video about Obamacare today, because it just really does anger me a lot. But I've kind of neglected the European Union issue. It's one of the reasons that I started writing these was because Americans don't know anything about the European Union and why it's falling apart, and they're not paying attention to it, and they don't care. And a lot of people on the liberal side still look at Europe as a model for government. They don't realize that the model is actually crumbling from within. It's going to implode very soon. There really is no house to save right now. The importance of Italy versus Holland rejecting the EU first is kind of a good question. Holland is much closer to Belgium, and it was one of the first signatories of the EU, just like Italy was. But being that nation that would be so close to the heart of the EU, Brussels, would leave the EU, because Brussels is in Belgium. Again, a lot of Americans, you can't take for granted they know even where Brussels is. If they were to leave the EU, that would signify the complete failure of the system. And I think that it would cause a chain reaction. Nobody thinks ahead. They think, okay, one nation leaves, the rest of them can compensate. It doesn't work that way. The terms of the EU membership are so parasitic to the domestic economies of those countries that the less countries participate, the more of a burden it's going to be. The Germans already front a massive amount of the tab for all the infrastructure or financial infrastructure, I should say, funding for the EU and funding for the projects. It's how they got themselves into the Greek crisis, and they did it to themselves. And there was really, there's two people to blame. There's the Greek government and there's the German government. Those are the two parties to blame. And what I'm trying to say here is that if Holland were to leave, the symbolism would be pretty sharp. This is the country that's most similar to Belgium, which is the heart of the EU, and they would be leaving. And Belgium itself is a basket case. Belgium, if you don't know, is a country that's divided along three ethnic lines, mainly two, but there are three. There's a German minority, very, very small, in the eastern border area with Germany, of course. And there are Fleming and Walloon communities there, and they don't get along. They don't have any linguistic similarities. The north, the Flemish north, Flanders, where did Ned Flanders get his name from? From that part of Holland called Flanders. Bet you didn't know that. That's my nerd fact of the night. Anyway, so they speak Dutch. In the southern part, the Wallonia speaks French, and they've never gotten along. The only thing that's united the Belgians has been the royal family and the Catholic religion. Those two things. So basically, their commonality is in an outdated form of government, the constitutional monarchy, at least as far as many Europeans think. to me, I don't have any objection to the constitutional monarchy. It just doesn't it doesn't jibe with their modern sensibilities. I mean, they have a system that's not in tune with nobility or inequality or anything like that. Anyway, forget Belgium. Why would Italy be a huge blow to leaving to the EU if they were to leave? Which I still think they're going to do it, and I still think the EU is going to fall apart. The only question is which pieces fall out first. Italy is one of the three major industrial powers of the EU, even though Spain to some degree has like a lot of industry. You have Germany, France, and Italy. The United Kingdom was also an industrial power in the EU, but their relationship was always a little more of a wild card, and I guess the word would be they were the exception to the rule. They didn't, for example, they didn't join the Eurozone. So it's not fair to compare, to call them an integral part of the EU. In fact, they're leaving the EU. So the three remaining industrial superpowers of the EU are France, Germany, and Italy. Italy is also central geographically to the EU. So the EU's defense policy would undergo a major crisis were Italy to leave, because now you have the southern border, so to speak, of the EU, the Mediterranean, moving hundreds and hundreds of kilometers north. In fact, along the German and Austrian borders and the French borders, because Switzerland is not a member of the EU. So you now have no EU border controls. The Schengen zone, or whatever they call it, is already labyrinth of retard, basically. It's very hard to know the visa restrictions of the EU. You kind of have to go along with the guide. I've never been to Europe, so don't call me an authority, but you know, we're seeing the EU gradually, in fact, well, it's accelerating. It's becoming a relic now. It's the same way as the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union limped along until it was finally officially dissolved until 1991. After 1989, you could probably see the cracks already forming. There's very little in common between Latvia and Kazakhstan. So it fell apart. There were plans to create a more sustainable union between the former Soviet republics, but it fell through because of attempts by the communist hierarchy to safeguard it with a coup. Okay, so the attempts to save it by these oligarchs, by these rulers, were what actually made it impossible for it to reform itself. It's the same thing that's happening with the EU. I'm not going to say that the EU is the same thing as the Soviet Union, but the process of it falling apart is the same. This guy, Jean-Claude Juncker, the head of the EU, I think he's the chair of the EU or whatever, he's issuing all these threats and public denunciations and saying, you know, that you're going to suffer if you fucking leave. It's empty threats. If there's no union to be in, there's no threat to be had for leaving it. At some point, I believe that the last two members of the EU to leave are going to be Belgium and Germany. I think that France is very fast on the way to leaving. Once Marine Le Pen goes in, France already left NATO, by the way, in the 60s. If you didn't know, France left NATO because the president of France at the time, Charles de Gaulle, could not agree with U.S. foreign policy. He wanted an independent foreign policy. He was zigging while they were zagging. He didn't give a fuck. You know, he left. And you know, anybody who says that France is our loyal ally and we have any, you know, fuck the French. They've never been they've never been a good ally to the United States, except maybe in the Revolutionary War. Okay, and we're talking about a different France at the time. That was a royal, that was a monarchy, for example. That was very different from the values that we know of France today. So anyway, I have to go do something else. Tomorrow is the end of it's you know, the beginning of the end of the EU. I think was Brexit. It's going to start becoming more frequent now. We're going to see other countries start to elect officials that are just going to piss on the stupid blue and gold flag that they have, and it's over. They have very little to fight for now. because the actual institutions are going to go bankrupt. Once the funders are out, once these countries start actually doing withholdings of funding, and disobeying the EU, the whole enterprise falls apart, because they're going to have to raise an army or some sort of enforcement division to force these governments to hand over the money, and B, this is only going to encourage more countries to leave. I believe Ireland's going to leave. I believe that you're going to see what's the next country? You're going to see a lot of those Eastern countries leave for sure. Poland and Czech Republic. They're not going along with the EU immigration policies, okay? And the EU immigration policies were not formulated by popular opinion. They were formulated by these bureaucrats in Brussels, along with the elite leaders of those countries, like Angela Merkel, like Francois Hollande. And they said, we're going to take in these refugees, come hell or high water. We don't give a fuck what the public says. And this is what they get today. You get this chaos in Sweden, the riots in Holland, which I didn't talk about. I've been very busy. I'm, working a new job, but Holland was already on the cusp of electing this person. He might get elected. I don't know if it doesn't work that way so easily in Holland like it does here. It's not like when you elect a congressman. It's like he gets the highest percentage of the vote in his district and he gets in. It doesn't work that way in Holland. I think they do proportional. So anyway, everybody have a great night. We're going to probably talk a lot more about Obamacare. The next Clinton thing, who knows when it's going to come out, because I'm just not working on it right now. Although I'm always reading. You should always know I'm always reading about the Clintons all the time. Anyway, this is Ramon with Bold Like a Leopard, and we'll see you around the bend.